Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to make a realistic old city street diorama with working lights. This build was super fun to make and I'm happy with the final result. During this video, I'll show you how to paint a realistic brick finish, how to make realistic trim pieces from dollhouse molding, how to weather buildings with acrylic paints, how to paint a weathered concrete sidewalk, how to make countertops from styrene and add a faux wood finish, how to paint miniature brass, and much more. Let's get started. First off, I designed my own model kit in Adobe Illustrator of a couple buildings found in Savannah, Georgia. It took quite a while to draw them up, but I used the same files to manufacture my own kit pieces at a local makerspace using a laser cutter. I don't have a laser cutter of my own, but it was nice to learn how to operate one and gain a new skill. I cut the main walls from MDF and the details were cut from chipboard and stencil board. I primed the MDF walls on the backside using a white primer and I primed the exterior walls using a red primer. I'm going to make two buildings for this diorama, one being a large brick building that's going to be a restaurant and a smaller beige building that's going to be a bank. I'm also going for an old 1930s look for this model. Also, this thing is going to be huge. The facade of the brick building is 30 inches wide and 20 inches tall, and the bank is about 15 inches wide and 18 inches tall. With all the parts primed, I start by painting the brick surface. The red primer makes a good base coat for the red brick. I start by painting individual bricks with a variety of colors. I used a combination of burnt sienna, burnt umber, and transparent red oxide made from golden acrylics, as well as a mix of flesh tones from Vallejo for the lighter bricks. There's no rhyme or reason to this step, just randomly paint the bricks different colors. You can totally change the look of the wall based off of what colors you pick. This is the most vibrant brick wall that I've painted for the channel so far, and it isn't anything like the real building ironically. The building in real life is actually a very light beige brick color, and being that the smaller bank building is beige, I opted to change it to red. Also, as for the details of this building, I did lots of redesigning to come up with the look that I ended up with. My goal wasn't to replicate these buildings exactly the way that they were, but rather to use the base structure as a starting point for my retro theme. As for the texture itself, I'll say that it's very convenient that I don't have to scribe each brick like I've done in previous projects, but painting the brick still took forever. For those that don't have access to a laser cutter, but also don't want to spend hours scribing a brick texture, I've seen lots of models look great using those plastic sheets with embossed brick texture. Here's how the bricks look all painted so far, and yes, I know it doesn't look realistic. At this stage, it's more important to establish tonal variety and contrast because all of the next steps will tone down this look. I sanded the edges where the corners meet at a 45-degree angle so that the brick pattern meets up properly at the corners. I glue the MDF pieces together using super glue. Unfortunately, I had a small gap at the corners, so I masked the gap with some masking tape and I filled it with joint compound. The masking tape prevents me from filling in the brick texture where I don't want to. Once dry, I sand back the excess compound until it's nice and smooth, and I double check to make sure that the gap is filled. Then, I remove the tape and I scribe the brick texture into the corner using my X-Acto knife. This will make the brick pattern look seamless at the edges. Then, the joint compound was painted over using the same acrylic brick paints that I used earlier to paint the individual bricks. This is how it looks so far. Again, the colors look very vibrant and cartoonish at the moment, but I'll show you how to tone this down in the next few steps. These shots give an idea of how absolutely massive this building is. Next, I fill in the mortar joints by smearing spackle into the brick texture. It's a bit messy, but it's super easy to do, and I wipe off any excess using a paper towel. Because this building is huge, I work in sections for this step to make sure that the spackle doesn't dry on unwanted places on the surface. I just smear it in a contained section, wipe off the excess, and move on to the next section. I find that this step alone makes a huge difference in terms of realism. The building had a single row of half bricks that protruded from the surface towards the top of the facade, so I etched the brick pattern into a piece of chipboard separately. Then, I glued it in place using super glue. This is how the building looks now, and from this step alone, I think it looks much more realistic. However, it's still a bit too vibrant for my taste, so I mix up an acrylic wash of buff and deck tan and paint it over the entire surface. I paint it on and dab it off with a paper towel, being sure to work in sections like I did with the mortar. I know this effect looks super strong as it goes on, but this effect is much more subtle once it dries. This helps give a slightly dusty layer to the surface, which does a couple of things. It helps unify all of the different colors of the brick, and it also tints the bright white mortar joints into a more realistic off-white color. Once the wash dries, I apply masking tape across the model. As you can see, there are parts of the wall that are missing brick texture, and that's because there are very textured stripes that are supposed to go there. After all of the tape is in place, I add texture by applying a thick layer of joint compound between the tape. Once the compound is applied, I use a stiff acid brush and start stippling the texture into the surface. I just work my way along the stripe and continue to repeat the process for all of the other stripes. The tape helps prevent the compound from getting on unwanted areas. While the compound is hardening but still a little bit soft, I remove the tape, which should leave behind really clean lines. There were a couple spots where I got compound where I didn't want to, but I'll show you how to clean it up soon. To remove the excess joint compound, I just dip a brush in some water and then start to scrub it away. It's super easy to do, just make sure not to wait too long after applying the compound, because the longer you wait, the harder it will be to remove. This cutout section is going to have some white trim in it, so I paint the edges white. Over here, the trim piece will have some holes in it, so I paint it black to add some depth behind the holes in the trim. This will make sense later on. These cutout sections will have black window frames here, so I paint the edges black. The textured stripes are fully dry now, and I stain them with a wash of deck tan to give them a light tannish gray tone. This is how the building looks at this point. I know it's a bit messy right now, but it'll look a lot better once the trim is installed. Here's a large cornice piece that I got from Hobby Lobby, and I'm cutting the ends at a 45-degree angle with my razor saw. To add some more detail and dimension, I glue the trim piece to a basswood strip using super glue and white glue. Since my building is so long, I have to connect the two pieces of molding. Then, I fill the seam with more joint compound. I glue an 1/8 inch by 1/2 inch thick piece of basswood strip on top of the molding, doing my best to replicate the reference with what I have. Then, I take my assembled piece and glue it to a long strip of chipboard. I add more detail by using some styrene strips, glued in place using super glue. Also, it has other decorative elements like this one that I'm making from a chipboard piece, along with a basswood strip and some styrene strips. Again, this piece is very long, roughly 28 inches, and it needs to be extended with several strips of basswood and styrene. I designed this piece in Illustrator and cut out the design on the laser using chipboard. Lastly, I make some more trim using smaller dollhouse cornice pieces, as well as some 1/16 inch by 1/2 inch thick basswood strips. Here's a close-up of how all of these pieces look. Once assembled, I took them outside and gave them a nice coat of primer to unify all of the materials. I forgot that the recessed trim piece had some decorative flower embellishments, so I designed them in Fusion 360 and printed them on my 3D printer. Then, I glued them in place using more super glue. I also designed and printed a sign that is seen on the real building. I have no idea who Charles Lammas is, but his name is there, so I added it. Now, I simply just paint all of the trim pieces white and black using a brush and sponge. Normally, I would have used spray primer, but I was all out at this moment. With all of the pieces painted, I started gluing them in place one at a time using super glue and white glue again. The super glue helps provide the instant grab, while the white glue provides a more durable and flexible bond over time. Here's how the buildings look with all the assembled trim pieces glued in place. As you can see, it really tidied up the building and it added lots of realism to it. However, the building overall looks a bit too clean for my taste. I weather the white trim pieces with a highly diluted dark brown acrylic wash. It makes the pieces look older and weathered, and it also helps accentuate surface details by flowing into the cracks and crevices. I continue spreading the wash around all the trim pieces with a brush, and going over it with a sponge until I'm happy with the look that I'm going for. Next, I add some heavier grime to the bricks underneath some of the trim pieces by scrubbing on a black wash and then blending it out with some water on a brush. I focus this effect on the bottom side of overhangs, which helps emphasize shadows. Now it's time to assemble the bank, which is going to require a different approach when compared to the brick building. I kept the walls on the brick building separate at first because it made painting the bricks easier. However, this building is going to be more or less one color and it has a lot of detail, so it makes more sense to assemble everything first and then paint it. I added some masking tape at the corners and I filled the gaps with some joint compound like I did previously. I removed the tape and sanded the compound flush with the walls, and then I rescribed the lines with my X-Acto knife. I built out this miniature ledge with some scrapped MDF strips, which I'll end up detailing later with some molding. Now, I'm adding several pieces of chipboard that I previously primed to reproduce the decorative elements on the building. You could use anything like wooden strips or styrene sheets would also work well for this step. Like before, I fill any seam with joint compound as I go along. It's amazing how much detail you can build up just using some simple flat shapes. Here, I'm adding some 3D printed pieces that I designed in Fusion 360. Now, I'm adding some decorative detail simply by gluing and stacking varying widths of basswood strips. I start with 1/32 by 1/4 inch, then I stack 3/16 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch on top to get a layered effect. Now I'm adding some dollhouse molding around the building in a few different spots. I make sure to cut the ends at a 45-degree angle with my razor saw so that the molding lines up nicely at the corners. Again, I'm stacking a couple of basswood strips for some more detail. The top of the building had a few hollow L-shaped sections at the corners, so I'm adding some PVC foam board on the back 2 corners and some more board on top of all 4 corners. I add some of these wooden spheres that I got from Hobby Lobby to the top of each corner, again using some super glue. Here's how all the finished detail looks. Again, it's amazing how a few flat rectangles and some dollhouse molding and basswood strips can really transform the look of a building. I take it outside and give it another coat of primer to unify all of the new materials on the surface, and once that's dry, I spray the entire building with a couple coats of Rust-Oleum Smoky Beige. This is how the color looks once dry, and now I'm weathering the building using a dark black-brown acrylic wash. I scrub the wash over the surface and then blot it away using a paper towel, which leaves behind a mottled texture, and it slightly darkens the surface. I add some streaking rain marks by brushing some of the wash under the overhanging trim and then dragging it down with a flat brush. To add some more variety to the surface, I pick out a few random tiles and give them another coat of wash. I blot away the excess wash, which gives the tiles a darker appearance. I just continue to work my way across the building in sections, making sure to coat the wash over all of the details. And here's how the weathering turned out after using just one color of wash. Now I'm painting the interior walls using some craft acrylic paints. These walls are for the brick building and the color is light ivory. I spread the paint around with a foam brush and then I stipple the surface to get rid of the large brush marks. The interior of the bank is painted in the same way using ivory, which is more yellow than the light ivory. I also paint this white trim piece out front of the bank. Next, it's time to assemble the windows. Here are 3 layers of chipboard and stencil board. I just stack them on top of one another using white glue. I use super glue to add a decorative piece that I 3D printed. Now, I'm adding some more detail with some styrene strips. These windows go on the second story of the brick building. I stacked 3 layers of cut stencil board for the windows on the bottom floor. If you want to scratch build your own windows like this, check out my Starbucks diorama tutorial where I show you how to make similar window frames using strips of styrene. Now, I'm adding some more detail using styrene strips. For the second floor of the bank, I again used 3 pieces of laser cut stencil board. Then, I had some more depth using some styrene again. All of these windows would be easy enough to 3D model and print as one piece, but I wanted to see what I was capable of making with the laser cutter. Also, sometimes my 3D printed windows and doors warp a bit. Let me know in the comments below if you have any tips for preventing thin, flat 3D print resin pieces from warping. Next, I do the same thing and I assemble the doors using some layers of stencil board. Here's how they turned out, and I love the amount of detail that they have. I take them outside and give them a coat of gray Tamiya primer and then some white primer, which will be the final color. The large windows for the first floor of the brick building are primed black. Once dry, I weather the window frames. I give the black pieces a deck tan wash, which brings out all of the detail and lightens the paint up a little bit. The wash goes on very strong, but it dries to a more subtle finish. The white window frames get a coat of dark black brown acrylic wash, and I just make sure to get in all of the cracks and crevices. For the glass itself, I'll be using some clear acetate sheet. I'm trying a new method of attaching the frames to the glass by using some spray adhesive. I just spray the backs of the window frames using Super 77 and I press them down onto the flat acetate sheet. Once the frames are firmly locked in place, I use a sharp X-Acto blade and cut along the edge of the window frames. This is how the first one looks. Absolutely no glue smudges whatsoever. I repeat the process for the rest of the windows. I also find it super beneficial to wear gloves at this stage. For whatever reason, sometimes removing fingerprints from acetate can be really difficult, so you can avoid that problem altogether by wearing gloves. I glue the large window frames in place using some super glue, and the rest of the windows are pressed into place on the second floors. I used some black gaff tape on the back side of the brick building to cover up small gaps which can leak light. You won't be able to see any of the tape in the final product. Moving on, I begin to rescribe some of the line detail into the MDF sidewalks with the Tamiya scribing tool. I could have solved this issue by upping the power of the laser, but this being my first time, I didn't notice that the lines were too shallow at first. You can also make some sidewalks using XPS foam, which I have a tutorial for. I also made sidewalks using PVC foam board and an X-Acto blade for the same Starbucks model that I mentioned earlier. Once the lines are scribed, I sand back some of the raised edges using 320 grit sandpaper. Be sure to wear a respirator when sanding, and especially when sanding MDF. I also carry the curb lines down by scoring the lines with the box cutter. Here are the sidewalk pieces before paint. I sprayed them with a gray Rust-Oleum primer, and then I added deck tan and a black acrylic wash to the surface. I applied them like I did to the bank, but I dabbed them with a sponge to add more texture and after applying them with a brush. Once the initial coat was dry, I went back and I applied another coat of black wash, but only to specific slabs, to create some variation in the sidewalk surface. Again, I textured the wash with a sponge and I repeated this process until I was happy with the result. Once the wash was dried, I gave the surface a light sanding to bring out some more texture. Then, I used some watered down acrylic paint and I speckled some white, tan, and black dots all over the surface. This really helps break up the surface and add some more texture. I designed some tile floor graphics in Adobe Illustrator and I printed them off. Now I'm cutting them out using my X-Acto knife. Here's how the tile floor for the bank looks up close. I sprayed the back with Super 77 spray adhesive and then I pressed it into place. I did the same for the checker tile floor for the restaurant, but I had to print it in pieces due to the building being so long. I made a large 2-foot by 5-foot base using thick MDF fixed on top of a pine wood frame, and now I'm rolling on a gray asphalt paint color for the road surface. Then, I glue on the sidewalk pieces with the tile floors attached onto the base using super glue. I drill a total of 4 holes equally spaced into the sidewalk for some streetlights that I plan on adding later on. Now, I'm gluing on the buildings. They have a few registration tabs that slot into the base. Once in place, I run a thick bead of super glue along the seams. I install the windows that were made earlier for the brick building. With the structure of the model nearly complete, I start to focus on the smaller details, lots of which I 3D designed and printed on my own 3D printer. All of the STL files that I created for this video are available for download on my Patreon for Gold and Platinum members in case you would like to download them for yourselves. Now, I'm removing the supports with an X-Acto blade. Most of these models are really fragile and this usually takes a lot of time. I always make sure to print extra parts in case I accidentally break something. I printed a few chairs and tables for inside and outside the restaurant, as well as parts for my streetlights, some tile pieces, and several other details. I could have used a styrene sheet for the tile, however, my local hobby shop doesn't have the right size in stock, and ordering it online usually takes a while, so that's why I 3D printed those pieces. Any remaining support marks are sanded back using a sanding stick. Again, just be sure to wear a respirator so you don't get any of the dust in your lungs. With all of the prints cleaned up and sanded, it's time to assemble them. I cut several pieces of 040 by 080 styrene strips to a 2-inch length, and I glue them to one end of my cast iron bench in equal spacing. Once glued in place, I flip it around and I glue the other end of the bench in place. I also glue together a couple of pieces to make a bar stool. For all of my cast iron surfaces, I brush on a thin layer of gloss Mod Podge and then I stipple it with a sponge to add texture. This includes the pieces that I made for my street lamps as well as the bench that I just assembled. Here's how the texture looks once dried, and I think it looks awesome. Super simple and easy to do. To prep the parts for painting, I add some tape to some scrap board and I stick the pieces that I want to paint onto the tape. I organize the pieces by which color I want to paint them. Using some white surface primer, I painted a couple doors, the sunburst metal chairs, and a round tabletops to go with the chairs. Using a mahogany primer, I sprayed the interior chairs as well as some table frames for the interior of the restaurant. And lastly, I sprayed some gloss black on all of my cast iron benches and street lamp parts, as well as any pieces that I wanted to paint brass, like my door handles and doorknobs, as well as the bar stools. Before I move over to the paint booth, I need to make some styrene countertops for each building. One will be used for the bank teller cages, and the other will be used in the restaurant with the bar stools. I start by cutting an L-shaped piece of 060 styrene sheet that is 1 1/4 inches wide. I use styrene pieces to cut a height of 1 3/4 of an inch to build up the countertops. Next, I install some dollhouse molding at the bottom of the counter using super glue. Then, I glue on a series of 3/16 inch styrene strips to create the paneled surface along the front and sides of the countertop. Like I mentioned earlier, I ended up building 2 of these. Both are similar in design, but are mirror images of one another, and the dimensions vary slightly. Also, here are the bank teller cages made from chipboard, styrene, and dollhouse molding. Moving on to painting, I spray the gloss black doorknobs and bar stools with some alclad chrome as a base layer for the brass finish. Be sure to build up the chrome effect over time rather than putting on a super heavy coat at first. Next, I apply the brass tint that I mixed from Tamiya Clear Yellow, Clear Red, and Smoke. Now, I'm painting the tile pieces gloss green. The exterior table stands get painted with a dull green color. I paint the fire hydrants and the interior chair cushions with Tamiya red paint. I primed the styrene countertops brown and then gave them a coat of Tamiya buff on top of that. This light color will be the base coat for the wood grain effects later on. I paint some small flowers red and purple as well as white and pink off camera. Once dry, I start by painting the fake wood finish on the countertops using oil paints. I only use 3 colors, black, burnt umber, and burnt sienna. I load up the cheap chip brush with a mix of all 3 colors and simply start brushing it on. I use the chip brush for the initial application of getting the paint onto the surface. Once the paint is applied, I move over to a softer paintbrush and I start brushing the oil paint in straight lines in one direction. You can see it starts to smooth out the texture and makes the wood grain look more to scale and like a finished piece of wood. Now, I just repeat these steps for the rest of the pieces. The oil paint takes about a day to dry, and you can make it dry quicker by leaving it in front of a fan. Here's how the final wood effects look. I painted the bank teller cages with some gloss black, and I glued it to the countertop using super glue. I paint some terracotta flower pots using some cheap acrylic paints. Once dry, I fill them with some sand and then some real dirt towards the top. Then, I soak the dirt with isopropyl alcohol and then some diluted matte Mod Podge to lock everything in place. Next, I add some green plants by Diorama Pressape on top of the dirt. I love the way these look and I think they're super realistic. Next, I take my painted 3D printed flowers from earlier and then I remove them from the supports using side cutters. Then, I glue each flower individually to the plants using super glue. I've done this process before in my Santorini Greece diorama, so feel free to check it out as I go into more depth in that video. I weather the table stands by brushing on some burnt umber acrylic paint and then wiping off the excess before it dries. Then, I glued the tabletops in place using super glue. Next, I glue the red chair cushions in place with some super glue. Next, I score and snap some rectangular pieces out of styrene, which will be the tabletops for the table frames that I 3D printed for the interior of the restaurant. The tile pieces get some joint compound smeared into the cracks and then the excess compound is wiped away with a soft rag. Here, I'm gluing in some MDF pieces along the entryway for the bank. Now, I'm installing the tile pieces using super glue. You may be wondering why I didn't use the laser etched tile lines, but long story short, the engraved lines weren't wide enough for the look that I was going for. Now, it's time to add the window frames for the bank's bottom floor. You may have noticed that I didn't previously assemble the window frames for this part of the building. That's because these are large display windows and I thought it would be easier to scratch build these directly into the structure using styrene strips. Again, I use clear acetate for the glass, but since the frames are made from styrene, I can glue the acetate in place using some thin cement. Now, I add some super glue to the back of my door handles and I fix them in place along the front doors. Then, I glue them into the entryway and I fix it in place inside the building. Now, I'm adding some styrene pieces that I painted ivory to hide the laser cut MDF surface. I installed the trim around the perimeter of the floor that I made from basswood strips and painted with burnt umber acrylic paint. Now, I add the styrene countertop. Next, I slide in some doors along the back wall which look like this. Then, I flip it around and press it into place. Once the back wall is properly aligned, I run beads of superglue along the seams. Moving on to the restaurant, I installed the front doors using superglue where we left off earlier. Then, I add some basswood strips painted brown along the interior walls. Next, I glue on some white dollhouse molding along the bottom. Once that was done for all of the walls, I glue them in place using superglue. Again, I designed these walls to have slots along the bottom so that they fit perfectly in place. Here, I'm test fitting the counter for the bar to see where I want to place my bar stools. Here's a closer look at the brass finish that we achieved earlier, and I really like how they turned out. I remove the counter now that I know where I want to put it, and I just eyeball the spacing of the bar stools. Then, the counter is glued in place. For the other half of the restaurant, I glue down a few of the tables that we made earlier, and then I glue down 4 chairs per table. Next, I glue in the 3 doors along the back wall. Finally, I glue on the ceilings that I assembled from 3 layers of laser cut chipboard with holes in them for lighting. These were glued in place with white glue. Lots of people requested in previous videos that I install lighting, so I decided to do it for this project. Since I wanted the second floors to have lighting as well, I quickly made some basic rooms using foam core and printed tile and basswood trim. And then I glued them in place so there is at least something visible through the windows and not just my messy LED wiring. Being that this was my first time doing LED lighting like this, I didn't record the process because it required my full attention. This was the first time that I tested out all of the interior lights and I love the way that it looked. In my spare time, I might go back and add some more lights to my previous dioramas. Here are some of my assembled street lamps from the 3D printed pieces that I textured and painted earlier. Again, I didn't film me threading the LED lights through the street lamps because it was super tedious and time consuming. Also, the white globes came from a cheap set of LED string lights that came off Amazon. I just ripped off the globes and drilled out the inside so I could have my own micro LEDs that I also got on Amazon in place. All the lights used for this project, by the way, were the same warm white micro LEDs. Here's how the diorama looks so far with the streetlights glued to the sidewalk. The road surface was too clean, so I weathered it using the same process as the sidewalk. I started off with a tan acrylic wash and then moved on to a darker black wash. I blotted the wash with a paper towel instead of a sponge due to the large surface area. Once the wash was dried, I sanded the surface with 320 grit sandpaper to bring out some more texture. Then, I speckled on some more black and white dots using watered down acrylic paint and a cheap, stiff bristle brush. Then, I printed off some signs for the bank and restaurant that I designed in Illustrator. I just cut the sign for the bank out with an X-Acto blade straight from the paper, and the restaurant sign I mounted to a piece of chipboard and then cut it out. The street lights were mounted to a styrene sheet and then cut out. I painted the back side of the styrene silver to give a metal finish. The chipboard left a brown finish along the edges of the restaurant sign, so I painted it black with acrylic paint. I glued the signs in place using some white glue. Next, I'm adding the table and chairs that we assembled and painted earlier. I'm gluing them to the sidewalk using super glue. I made 3 cast iron benches in total, and I installed 2 outside the front of the bank along with flower pots on either side of the building. The third bench and 2 remaining flower pots were glued to the right side of the building outside of the window. I painted the US mailbox a bronze color by dry brushing a metallic acrylic paint over a black base coat. I dirtied up the red fire hydrant by giving it a black enamel wash. I glued the fire hydrant to the sidewalk, and then I glued the mailbox to the light post as seen in some of my references. I glued the 2 street signs to the light post at the corner of the sidewalk. Lastly, I glued a couple of trim pieces to transition the concrete sidewalk to the tile entryways of the building, and with that, the model is finished. I took the model outside for some daytime shots, and I also did some night scenes inside, and I got these shots of the final result. I bought some 1930s diecast cars to park outside of the buildings, and I love the way that they look. This model was a lot of fun, but it was super challenging. It's been over 2 months since I posted my last video, and this project was the reason why. I learned lots of new techniques throughout this project, and in the end, I think the process was worth it. It's not perfect, and I would have loved to add lots of detail in the interiors of the building by adding lots more furniture, silverware, plates, and so on, but I also just needed to get this project done. This was my largest scale project so far, and for time's sake, I'll be doing a couple of smaller projects next so I can release the videos in a timely manner. But I would love to know what you think of this diorama and how it turned out, so feel free to let me know in the comments below. Also, thank you so much to my awesome patrons. Your support really helps to fund these projects because making dioramas isn't the cheapest hobby in the world. You all really help me cover the cost of materials for these projects, and it makes creating these videos affordable for me, which is really appreciated. If you'd like to join them and support me on Patreon, I'll have a link in the description below. Depending on what tier you select, you'll have access to behind the scenes pictures of whatever project I'm working on before I post to any other platform. Also, the STL files for all the furniture in this video, as well as the files for all of my previous projects, are available for download on my Patreon. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.